Today, we live in a world full of narcissism, self-presentation, and beautiful pictures with a perfect self. However, one author from America claims that being humble would actually be a better idea. And his name is Professor Daryl Van Tongeren from the United States. Daryl, I'm very happy to talk to you about the idea why being humble is a good idea.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's just go into it. I believe that we have seen, especially with your former president, Trump, that being not humble, being slightly over the top can bring you lots of success. So why are you claiming in your new book that being humble is actually a better idea?
I think there's a few reasons for that. The first is, I think in America in particular, and a number of Western societies, we're experiencing this increasing rise in narcissism. And people are self-aggrandizing, they're creating brands, they're managing their images, but they're also more lonely, disconnected, depressed, and anxious, more so than they've ever been before. And I think part of that is what's happening is we're attaching our sense of self-worth and who we are to external factors. We're putting our happiness in other people's hands. And I think humility is a different way of approaching yourself, approaching other people, and approaching the world that puts you in a place where your own security is not depending on what other people think of you, on the praise or adoration of others, the number of followers that you might have or likes that your content might generate, but instead it comes from assuredness of knowing that you are already loved and accepted and moving through the world with that type of real sense of security and confidence.
But Daryl, it seems to me so easy to charge your own self-worth through external factors, because you can create more YouTube subscribers easily. You can create a few more Instagram followers. And what you are proposing, being humble and going more towards the interior self, that seems to me more difficult. Why should I take the more difficult path?
Well, I think on the surface, it seems more difficult. But when you think that there's always more YouTube viewers to get, there's always more listeners to get, there's always more likes to get, that's true. And you could attach your self-worth to these quantitative numbers that suggest some type of value and significance in the world. The problem is there's always going to be somebody who has more likes, who has more listens, who has more views. And even if you're on top for a moment, it's not long before you're eclipsed. So if you put your self-worth in the hands of somebody else or some feature of life because you want to make sure that you're popular or other people like your content, you're really giving away your happiness, you're giving away your meaning, you're really giving away your sense of self. And so from the outside, it seems like humility is indeed harder, but I'm going to argue that it's freer. A life filled with humility is free from the narcissistic traps of our world.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it totally makes sense, especially the argument that you put the control on the outside because you can never control the amount of followers. However, you can control your internal values. And speaking of values and speaking of the value of being humble, in your book, you manage 3 features of being humble. And those are knowing yourself, checking yourself, and going beyond yourself. Could you expand on those 3?
Yeah, so the first feature of being humble is really knowing yourself. So this is an accurate and honest assessment of your strengths and your weaknesses. So knowing the things that you're good at, but also the things that you're not good at, acknowledging your cognitive limitations, some of the biases that you might have, and realizing the places where you are and are not the expert. The second is checking yourself. This one's a little bit hard. So we really want to find ways to accept praise. We want to take all the credit. We want to shirk all the blame. Checking yourself is us reeling in and slowing down our ego motives for self-aggrandizing and selfishness. And then third, we want to go beyond ourselves. So we want to consider the needs of other people. How can you think about what other people might need in a situation and prioritize their needs? So it's not just looking out for yourself. Okay, you do have to make sure you are taking care of yourself, but it's more than that. It's making sure you're taking care of and attending to the needs of other people.
Mm-hmm. Makes total sense. And towards the ends of your book, you're also talking about the humble humility revolution. You want actually not just to write a book, be published, and then some people think that this idea might work well. So I'm wondering how could this humility revolution take place? It seems like a movement that's hard to start. As you said, today is the time of self-aggrandizing, and you actually want to do the opposite. So how could this go along? How can your book be remembered and maybe be even a start of a small movement?
I think if we look around culturally, politically, any type of ideological spectrum, religious beliefs, we're living in a very divided time. And polarization is increasing rapidly. And sides are getting further and further apart. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to talk with people with whom we disagree. And in fact, we now shame other people for simply being friends with people who are ideologically dissimilar. And so it's very hard for us to talk across these different divides, and it's creating tension, it's creating loneliness, depression, but it's also creating violence, it's creating aggression. And we need to do something different, because digging our heels in the ground and staking our claim, it's just not working, because sides aren't talking to each other. We need a different approach. And so I am arguing that what we need is this revolutionary, radical approach to humility. Is individually and as a community, we need to work hard to see other people's perspectives. Now, humility is one of those things we want other people to have because it's good for us. But it's harder for us to say that we should start by being humble. But that's where it's going to begin. It's going to begin if we do the hard work to start being humble, and other people will see those benefits. And so what I'm arguing for is a radically different way of approaching each other, seeking out to understand other people's perspectives, empathizing where other people are coming from, viewing people who are different from you as offering strengths, and looking at diversity as enriching our lives, and being curious about things that we don't know, admitting that we don't know things. So I'm a professor in academia. It's, we say that we're curious and we say that we're always learning. Sometimes professors can be incredibly arrogant. We don't want to admit that we don't know things. There's a lot that I don't know. And we need to embody that not knowing, that curiosity, and the desire to learn from other people.
Mm-hmm. While I was reading your book, I came across an idea in my head that I would like to call the humble dilemma. And humble dilemma maybe also comes a little bit from the prisoner's dilemma in game theory, where what I do can actually be beneficial or can be not so good for me in case other people can exploit that. And to give you a little example, so sometimes I teach people how to make a good presentation or how to include themselves in a meeting talk, really put themselves forward to be seen by their superiors. And now I could imagine that if I accept your humble ideas and accept that being humble, listen first before talking, trying to understand before trying to argue against that, in the business world, especially where things have to go fast and you don't have the nice place or nice time of academia where you can actually talk for the whole day about an article, that in the business world, it could actually harm me to accept this idea of being humble, although theoretically and normatively, that would be the right thing to do. Because other people can exploit me being humble, then take charge of the meeting, take charge, present their ideas even more aggressively, so I am overseen. How do you also see this little problem of the humble dilemma, that some people might take use of us being humble?
Yeah, I love that. I love that term, humble dilemma. I think that's perfect. Yeah, and we tend to think about that as a risk of exploitation. And so some of the research my colleagues and I did, we looked at partners who just had their first child together, and so an extremely stressful time of life. And what we found is that in these romantic couples, when both partners were humble, they had the best outcomes. So they were more satisfied with their relationship, less anxious. Physiologically, they responded better when they were getting into arguments. But the problem was when one partner was humble and the other one was arrogant. And probably why that is problematic is just what you say, is that the arrogant person is exploiting the humble person. And so humility also requires us to have good boundaries. So being humble doesn't mean just always doing what everyone else wants and not having an opinion and simply just kind of rolling over. you have to have good boundaries. You have to know, and you have to make sure your needs are getting met, but not only your needs. So you're thinking of yourself and other people. Related to business, this is a place where I hear people say, well, I'm not sure humility really has a place in business. So Collins, in his book, Good to Great, talks about level 5 leadership. And what he talks about is the absolute best leaders are the ones who are incredibly hard driving, but they're also humble. And so my colleagues and I like to think about humility as a little bit of what we call a social oil. So it helps in high conflict, high power, high stakes negotiations. So in the business arena, leaders can really push hard on their employees as long as they're humble, because then their employees will be more responsive and more attuned to the high goals that the leader is setting forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the Book of Collins is, of course, a bestseller that some people might know, the Book of Collins. And also I remember another business book by Stephen Covey, where he recommends in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People to seek first to understand and then to be understood. I think that resonates quite well with your book and your ideas as well, because people have the tendency first to talk so that you understand my ideas, to put themselves first. But what we can do and should do is maybe sometimes put ourselves second. And I think Simon Sinek along those lines would also say leaders speak last in one of his books, that you shouldn't as a leader go in the front and say what you want to have to be done, but instead let other people talk first. And I think that could also not be wise from a business perspective, but also from the happiness perspective. And here for our viewers and our audience, a little connection that we both had. I wrote some stuff on happiness and discovered one of your articles where you wrote about the so-called happiness growth mindset. And we don't have to talk about that one, but what I would like to ask you, since you're an expert on happiness with regards to different areas of life, how being humble is actually transferring to feeling happier. So what's the connection there?
Yeah, so some of the ways that humility helps improve our own well-being, one of the primary ways that it does this is through improving our relationships. So scores and scores of studies have found that people really want to be in relationship with humble partners. So we've done research where we show dating profiles, and people are more likely to pick dating profiles of humble relative to arrogant people. They're more likely to want to share their phone number, meet this person, go out on a date. When we ask people who are in relationships, they rate their relationship as more satisfied when they're with someone who's humble. They're more likely to be committed to a humble partner, more likely to forgive. All of these things make relationships better. And when you're in a healthy and strong relationship, you're going to feel happier. Life feels more meaningful. You feel happier. So one of the ways that it does that is through improving our relationships. A second way is if you really are taking a fair and even-minded approach to the world, and you can see the world as it is, you're going to be able to deal with problems as they are, and you're going to be able to hopefully step out from some of the biases that cloud your own thinking. And so having an accurate engagement with the world around you helps you tackle problems as they are. And so that allows us to get healthier, to seek solutions that will improve our well-being and find a life that's happier because we're seeing the world more objectively.
Okay, Daryl, it seems that we have established that the topic humble is quite relevant for the business life and also for the private well-being. And in the second half of the interview, now it's probably time to give people some concrete steps that they can take to become more humble. Because if people are now convinced humble is good, let's try the humble version of my life. I'm sure you also had a personal way to getting slightly more humble, because every book that we write, I know that as an author myself, actually changes our personality, be it 5%, be it 15%, but it changes us, who we are and how we live in this world. So what are some good first 2 or 3 steps that we might take to get a little humbler than before?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we can do is we can try to seek feedback. So we can reach out to people that we trust, people whose opinion we value, and just ask them, what are some things that I'm not seeing? What are some of my strengths? What are some of my weaknesses? How humble do you think I am? And what are some areas where I really need to work? This is going to be a bit uncomfortable. We don't always like to hear the areas where we might need to improve, but it's really important. But it's also important to make sure that the source of feedback is trusted and someone who you value. Once you get that feedback, you really need to work hard to reduce how defensive you are about that feedback. So our natural inclination when someone shares something that we might need to work on is to immediately get defensive and say, why they're wrong and why, what we did was justified. So really to work hard to reduce your defensiveness. So once you have this feedback, once you've worked hard to reduce the defensiveness and take what they're saying as true, really the third thing, and perhaps one of the keys to humility, is building empathy. And empathy, it really has two parts. So one is being able to see the perspective of somebody else. So putting yourself in their shoes, in their mind, trying to understand where they're coming from. But it also has this emotional component of feeling what might they be feeling compassion and sympathy and positive feelings toward them. And then finally, we have to realize that the quest for humility, it's hard work. It's a bit like running a marathon. You're not going to get there overnight. And so you have to build your tolerance, you have to build your skill, kind of like building a muscle. You have to work at becoming more humble. And this is going to take constant trial and error. We're not always going to get it right, but you have to kind of work on self-regulation. So on controlling yourself, on regulating your selfish impulses, and really going out of your way to put forth the hard work into being more humble.
Mm-hmm. I think that all the three steps are super logical, but at the same time, all of them are kind of difficult. For instance, the first one, to receive negative feedback, that is not comfortable, as you said. But again, even if we don't like that, we could also take that at the start of being humble, because our perfect picture of oneself is slightly deteriorated, and we have to say, good that it's deteriorating, because what's actually in fact deteriorating is this self-aggrandized picture, possibly. So even receiving negative feedback and feeling bad about that could maybe be the first pill that we can swallow. But let me jump to the last thing that you said, where you said it's a marathon. We have to work on it. How personally, now, I mean, people really like personal examples. How do you personally work on that as a marathon? So for instance, we are leading this interview in the summer of 2022, where your book comes out. Do you have personal summer steps for more humility as a marathon training?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I want to start with is I am absolutely not the expert. And I mentioned about this in my book. The very first interview I ever did on humility, my wife and I were supposed to go to the beach that day. We live just a few miles from a big Lake Michigan. We were supposed to go to the beach. And I thought this interview would just take a few minutes, and ended up taking over an hour. And it really made I delayed all of our trip, and my wife was waiting. And then I go upstairs, I finished the interview, and I was at the time actually training for a marathon, and I hadn't yet got my run in. And I said, I know that I just made you wait an hour. Would you mind taking all this stuff to the beach and setting up? And I'm going to go for a run, and I'll meet you at the beach. So I literally just delayed things with my wife, and then was selfish and asked if I could go for a run. And then the interview asked me if I could ask my wife, how humble am I? And my wife gave me this really low rating on humility. And it's easy to see why. In the moment, I was only preoccupied with with what I wanted to do. And so I share that first by saying it's a constant effort for me. It's constantly something that I continue to work on. But as you're thinking about looking toward this summer, thinking about what are the concrete steps you can take, the first thing that you can do is think about people in your life who know you well and whose opinion you value. And sit down with them, and don't do this in a rushed way. Do this where you have plenty of time. Just ask them for some honest feedback. Ask them where are some ways where you really see me being humble, but where are also some ways that you see I need to work on my humility. So what are the ways I'm getting it right, but where are the ways that I'm not? When you receive, so that would be step one. Step two is when you get that feedback, don't respond. Just absorb it, take some time, think on it, and allow yourself to just process that information. The third would be, I would say, try to put yourself into situations where you're surrounded by people who are not just like you. Okay, so intentionally seek out community with people who are dissimilar from you in any number of ways, whether that's politically, religiously, ideologically, culturally, and start putting yourself in these situations where you can see other people just like you. You're going to become friends with them. They just hold different beliefs. And then I would say another thing that we could do is once you start doing that, is start committing each day. Try to do a week-long challenge. And each day that week, when you wake up, try to think of one way that you're going to enact humility just a little bit more than you did the day before. Whether that's listening before you speak, whether that's seeking out some information that you don't usually do. So go to different news websites than ones you usually go to. Call up that relative who believes wildly different political things than you and actually have an honest, real, not debate, but just listen to them. So each day for a week, try to enact something to be a little bit more humble than the day before. And then at the end, meet back with the person who gave you that initial feedback and say, how am I doing? I've been working on this for a bit. Do you see any improvement? And use that kind of like you would, in the same way you would use a watch on a training run. Am I moving closer to my goal? And kind of regularly checking in with someone who will give you that honest feedback can help.
Yeah, and by the way, since I'm also an author, I'm very curious what idea you are most proud of, because if you write a book, obviously, let's say 95% are from somewhere else. And this idea of being humble is, amongst others, an idea of Stoicism, where the Stoics actually argued you're not that important compared to the cosmic significance and vastness of the universe. Your personal problems and successes are really small. However, I am sure that every book adds a slightly new edge, a slightly new perspective. And writing the book, I'm sure that once you had, maybe even many times, you had the moment that you are most proud of. So what is your unique Daryl Van Tongeren contribution, as you believe, writing this book that comes from you, that you're most proud of?
I think in the conclusion, what I'm most proud of is I think what I'm arguing for is not only a humility revolution, but that we embrace the sense of what's called existential humility. So exactly what you were talking about. And sometimes the realization of our smallness, our insignificance in light of the cosmos, relieves us of this delusion that we're so special, that we're so important. And what it does is it puts us in our right place. And sometimes our right place in light of the cosmos is actually quite small. And what I'd love for us to do is be able to engage some of these really deep questions about what it means to be human. What's the meaning of life? What happens to us after we die? How do we live a moral life? These things that are so charged, I'd love for us to be able to embrace these things with humility, knowing people long before us have argued about different ways that they should live their life. And the world has gone on just fine without us. And after we're no longer here, we'll go on fine just well without us. And so being able to embrace kind of our smallness and in light of the cosmos, I think really does help us stay a little bit more humble and keeps us grounded.
And what helps me personally, by the way, I don't know how you view this idea, is this psychological term of the hotspot. I think it's called not hotspot, spotlight bias. So this false illusion that we are under spotlight. So whenever, for instance, I post an interview ours on YouTube, I believe that many people are waiting for this special interview to come out.
That's
or
right.
When I walk across the street and I eat ice cream in a new shirt, then I believe that people are noticing my new shirt. But in fact, this spotlight bias is a cognitive bias where nobody really cares. And I don't know if you use that sometimes, but for me, this idea of the spotlight bias really helps, that people do not much care of what I'm really doing today.
That's absolutely right, because they have their own spotlight and they're worried about themselves and their own new shirt and their own podcast. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, very cool. So at the end of the day, some listeners are from continental Europe. My channel is located in Germany, but I believe people all around the globe can get your either ebook or your physical book, Humble. And the last words, as always, belong to the guest. So Daryl, what would be the final message on the topic Humble?
I just love for us to think about a new way of approaching our life, one in which we approach ourselves, our relationships, our communities, and the world around us with honesty, authenticity, and a strong sense of humility. And I hope that if we start cultivating this in our own lives, it'll cascade to the lives of those around us in our communities, and we can start using our dedication to be more humble for good.
Perfect final words. And dear listener, the link to the book you will find in the description below. And let me know in the comment section if you believe that being humble can make you happier and can make you more successful, or general comments on this interview. I hope I see you soon on this channel. And if you haven't done it, then subscribe, and see you in a week. Goodbye.